Seeing as this is my first time doing this sort of thing, I figured I'd start out simple. So, here's a band that's pumped out a grand total of 2 releases throughout their short existence. Might not sound like much, but this band does have a little secret that I found kinda interesting. Well, it's not really a secret if you already know about them, but you'll see what I mean. The band's called Swollen. They're a technical death metal project hailing from Copenhagen, formed by ex-Dawnfall bassist Thomas Fagerlund and ex-Iniquity guitarist Mads, who also sung vocal duties. Anders Simmelkier was also brought in to play drums. As far as I know, the date the band was created is not known. If I had to guess, it might have been formed sometime in 1995 after Mads left Iniquity, a slightly more well-known Danish tech death band. I'll be mentioning them a lot throughout this video in case the title wasn't obvious enough. Swollen wasn't actually called Swollen when they first formed. They originally went under the name Hackflesh, but they must have changed it early on since that moniker wasn't used for anything by the band. Something else that changed relatively early on was the drummer. Anders quickly left and was replaced by Jacob Olsen, another former member of Iniquity. And like Mads, he also quit in 1995. Just after recording drums for their debut album, Serenadium. And with Jacob's entrance to the band, Swollen's lineup would not change until its demise. I guess it's also worth mentioning that Mads and Jacob were in a grunge project called F House Creeps, but I won't be talking about that in this video. I just thought I'd point this out because its lifespan appears to have mirrored that of Swollen's. Thought that was kind of interesting. And before I move on to what the band would eventually go on to release, I'd like to share one last thing I found regarding the band's lineup. From what I've seen, there was a time where Swollen tried rehearsing with a dedicated vocalist, whose name I do not know, and he almost joined the band. Notice how I said, almost. I don't believe he ever became an actual member of Swollen. He was kinda just there during the rehearsals for a brief time, yet seems like he was kicked out pretty quickly. Why? Supposedly, the ventilation in the band's rehearsal space wasn't very good, and he kept farting when the band was practicing. I really don't know if this actually happened, but I did read about this in the liner notes from one of Swollen's releases. It sounds completely made up, but I'd like to think it's real. Anyway, around the time that probably happened, the band had already started writing original material, and this would eventually culminate with the release of their debut EP. Recorded between August 13th and 15th of 1996, the EP was soon released with the title, The Breathless Waiting. The Breathless Waiting was limited to 300 copies, only on CDs. It was self-released by the band, so Mads and Thomas had to physically cut out the covers for each copy. Or at least, that's what they were supposed to do. I think they eventually gave up later on or something, because they started selling the EP without the cover included. Reviews for The Breathless Waiting are hard to come by, but today it seems well received for what it is. Original copies demand a bit of a premium though, with listings on Discogs going just under $100 at the time of making this video. As for the production, it's about what you'd expect from a technical or brutal death metal release from the time. Not the most high-fidelity sounding thing in the world, but by no means do I think it sounds bad. I think that's about what you'd expect from a release like this anyway, given the circumstances that created it. The songs themselves are very similar to that of past Iniquity material, which really isn't all that surprising, seeing as Swollen is practically 2/3 Iniquity. So, here's some examples comparing this release with Iniquity's Serenadium, which came out about 4 months prior to The Breathless Waiting. By the way, they also do this a couple times in the title track. Now that you've heard some of the stuff off this EP, I'd like to give an honorable mention to the lyrics. They are absolutely vile, and they get worse with each subsequent track. Things seemed to go pretty well for a bit after the release of the Breathless Waiting, and Swollen started performing live more in the Copenhagen area. They also had the opportunity to film a music video for a local Danish TV station, but nothing groundbreaking ever came out of this because apparently the station kept broadcasting the video without any sound. Despite this, Swollen kept going on with their live performances for the next couple of years. And they also began writing new songs, which they ultimately recorded for a promo tape that was simply titled Promo 98. This tape is definitely the more elusive release from the band. There weren't many copies of it made, and it doesn't appear to have ever been officially released. However, I do have access to it, so I'll play a couple bits from the tape so you can get them in your head. Musically, I think you'd agree with me that Promo 98 doesn't sound that much different from the Breathless Waiting, but I'd still want you to pay extra attention to this release as it'll become a little more significant in a moment. It may help to remember the titles of the last 4 songs. Not long after Promo 98 was recorded, undisclosed tensions between Jacob and the rest of the band rose to an all-time high, leading to concerns regarding their abilities to work with each other. Iniquity was also in a bit of trouble. As a matter of fact, they had been for some time. The band had been dealing with some weird stuff regarding their lineup ever since the recording of Serenity in 1995. Wishing to find more permanent members for Iniquity, drummer asked Mads if he wanted to rejoin the band to do vocals and play guitar alongside Brian Erickson. He agreed, and Thomas also joined Iniquity to play bass. So, with Mads and Thomas gone, it was at this point that Swollen was no more. Oh, and Jacob was left behind too. It's now November of 1999, and Iniquity just put out a new album called 5 Across the Eyes. With Mads and Thomas in the band now, you can probably guess that the material on this album sounds a bit more like something you'd expect from Swollen. And you'd be right. You can tell just from listening to some of the songs. Wait a minute. This song sounds very familiar. And that title does too. Where have I heard it before? Let me back things up a bit. I think you see what I'm getting at here, and this isn't the only time this happens on Five Across the Ice. If you haven't connected the dots yet, let me show you what's going on here. 4 of the tracks on this album were originally written not by Iniquity, but by Mads, Thomas, and Jacob when they were still in Swollen. They're the same 4 songs that appeared on tracks 2 through 5 from Promo 98. At first, this might seem like a lazy move by Iniquity, but I can understand why they did this. Let me explain. No one really knew about these 4 songs when Swollen was around because Promo 98 never had a proper release. Not to mention they were never a huge band to begin with. But even if Swollen ended up getting more popular, these songs wouldn't have had much of a future anyway, since the band broke up for good not long after they were first written and recorded. So, if anything, their inclusion on Five Across the Ice is actually a bit of a saving grace. For those of you already familiar with Five Across the Ice, it's obvious to see now that this particular move ended up working in Iniquity's favor. The album seems to have been received very well over the years, and the inclusion of the 4 songs from Promo 98 also negated any chance of the album being delayed, which likely could have caused a whole bunch of other problems for the band. Iniquity was also able to keep going for a little longer after the release of Five Across the Ice. They ended up putting out another album, a single, and a compilation before calling it quits in 2003. For the first time, at least. They reunited a couple times after that, but no new material was ever released after that point.
Shut the fuck up. You're meat.
Seems like I've started talking a lot more about Iniquity, but I'm not finished with Swollen quite yet. I have one last thing to say regarding their 2 releases. After being gone for almost 25 years, a limited edition compilation containing the Breathless Waiting and Promo 98 was released by American label Dark Symphonies in 2021. I happen to have a copy of this release and I'm very happy with it. I've used it as a reference throughout this video. I first learned about those stories about the farting vocalists and the failed music video through the liner notes. It also has some art of questionable subject matter doodled onto the Promo 98 lyric sheets. I figured you'd like to know this was a thing. As I mentioned earlier, both of Swollen's releases are hard to come by. The Breathless Waiting is pretty expensive, and Promo 98 practically doesn't exist. So if you're looking for a physical copy of the band's music, this compilation is pretty much your only reasonable option unless you're willing to pay some unjustifiable sum for either a release. Well, I guess that's about it. Looking back, this wasn't nearly as simple as I thought it'd be, but I still hope you got something out of this video. If I'm missing any valuable information or I got something wrong, go ahead and put it in the comments because I'd like to know. I'm still figuring out what I'm doing here too, so I wouldn't be surprised if something's not quite right. Anyway, that's all I have for now, and I hope to see you around again sometime. Take care.